She answered a stranger's ad for a mail-order bride. But she wasn't looking for love. She was running for her life. With a hidden gun, a stolen ledger, and a dead husband's secret that could bring down an entire railroad empire. And the cold, broken rancher who thought he was buying a housekeeper? He had no idea the most dangerous thing he'd ever let through his door was her. What this story reminds us: the people who arrive broken into our lives are sometimes the very ones sent to save us. This channel is home to stories of the wild frontier, rugged cowboys, forbidden love. If this story moves you, leave a comment below. I read every single one. Share it with someone who loves a good tale. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe so you never miss the next one.
The steam locomotive shrieked, a mechanical beast dying in the teeth of the Montana winter. Wyatt Sterling didn't flinch at the deafening blast. He stood on the frozen planks of the Copper Creek station, his broad shoulders braced against a wind that carried the scent of iron, coal fire, and coming snow. He pulled the collar of his sheepskin coat higher, his jaw locked tight. Around him, the few townsfolk brave enough to face the November freeze hurried about, but Wyatt stood still as a rusted anvil. He watched the train grind to a halt in a cloud of blinding white steam. Let the wind howl, Wyatt thought, his gloved hands curling into fists inside his pockets. Let the snow bury the tracks. He had buried his soul 5 years ago under 6 feet of frozen earth alongside his first wife. He was a man made of calluses and cold logic now. He would never let his heart beat for another woman. But a ranch the size of his couldn't survive on stubbornness alone. The cabin was falling into ruin. The meals were charred meat and bitter coffee, and the long nights were a dangerous kind of quiet. He needed a housekeeper. He had paid for one. Through the thinning smoke, the passenger car door opened. She stepped out carefully, her dark wool skirt heavy with dampness. Wyatt's pale eyes narrowed. Evelyn Vance. She looked exactly like the destitute widow her letters had claimed her to be. She was slender, almost fragile against the backdrop of the rugged Bitterroot Mountains. A drab mourning veil obscured the top half of her face, but he could see her lips were pale from the cold. She carried a single battered leather trunk that looked like it might fall apart if the wind hit it too hard. Wyatt stepped forward, his boots heavy on the frost-heaved boards. He didn't offer a smile. He didn't know how anymore. "Mrs. Vance," he said. His voice was like grinding stones. She flinched slightly, her head snapping up. Beneath the veil, he caught the briefest flash of striking, intelligent hazel eyes before she lowered her gaze to his boots. "Mr. Sterling, I presume." Her voice was soft, trembling just enough to complete the picture of a timid woman at the mercy of a harsh world. "I have the wagon hitched out back," he said, reaching for her trunk. "The ride up the mountain is 4 hours. If you need to warm yourself by the station stove, do it now. We don't stop once we're moving." "I am ready," she murmured, clutching her small woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. Wyatt swung the heavy trunk up effortlessly, though he noticed it was surprisingly dense for a woman with no belongings. "Let's get one thing straight before we leave this platform," he said, turning back to tower over her. "My letters laid it out, but I prefer speaking plain. This is a transaction. I need a woman to keep the house, cook the meals, and mend the clothes. You needed a roof and a man's surname to keep from starving in the streets." He paused, letting the bitter wind underscore his words. "I will provide for you. I will protect you. But don't expect poetry, and don't expect a husband. You'll have your own room. We live as partners in labor, nothing more." Evelyn kept her eyes cast downward. "A cold marriage was all I expected, Mr. Sterling. I ask for nothing more than a quiet place to work." "Good." Wyatt nodded once, a sharp, dismissive motion. "Follow me." The wagon ride up the mountain was brutal. The trail was deeply rutted, the mud frozen into jagged peaks that threatened to snap the wooden wheels. Wyatt drove the team of draft horses with silent efficiency. his eyes scanning the tree line. He didn't offer her extra blankets, testing her grit right out of the gate. Evelyn sat rigid on the unforgiving wooden bench beside him. She didn't complain when the sleet began to fall, stinging their cheeks like buckshot. She didn't whimper when the wagon jolted violently. She just sat there, her hands folded neatly in her lap, enduring the punishment of the frontier with a terrifying stillness. It was nearly dusk when the Sterling ranch finally bled through the gray storm. The cabin was a sturdy, practical fortress of dark pine sitting in a valley surrounded by jagged, snow-capped peaks. No curtains in the windows, no flowers by the steps, just a barn, a woodshed, and a house built to keep out the world. Wyatt brought the horses to a halt. He jumped down and carried her trunk inside, kicking the heavy oak door open. The cabin was freezing, the hearth dead and gray. "Your room is the door on the left," Wyatt commanded, setting the trunk at the foot of her narrow bed. "I sleep in the loft. I'll see to the horses and bring in firewood. You can start familiarizing yourself with the kitchen." "Yes, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice barely a whisper in the echoing cabin. Wyatt turned his back on her, his heavy boots retreating toward the front door. He didn't look back as he stepped out into the blizzard, pulling the door shut behind him. Alone in the dim, freezing cabin, Evelyn Vance finally exhaled. The hunched, timid posture she had held for 4 hours vanished. Her spine straightened into a line of pure steel. She threw back her mourning veil, revealing a sharp, beautiful face set with a predator's calculation. Her hazel eyes swept the room, not evaluating the dust or the cold stove, but checking the sightlines from the windows, noting the thickness of the doors, and memorizing the exits. She walked over to her battered trunk. Her hands weren't trembling anymore. With a practiced fluid motion, Evelyn reached up her right sleeve. With a soft metallic click, a silver double-barreled Derringer slipped from its hidden leather holster perfectly into her palm. She flipped the chamber open, checking the 2 brass cartridges gleaming in the fading light before snapping it shut. Wyatt Sterling thought he had bought a helpless, broken housekeeper. He thought his biggest problem was a frozen heart. Evelyn slipped the gun back up her sleeve, her jaw setting into a hard line. He has no idea, she thought. She hadn't come to this mountain to be a wife. She had come to survive. And heaven help the men who were hunting her when they finally came knocking on Wyatt Sterling's door. The cabin was a cathedral of oppressive silence, measured only by the rhythmic tick-tock of the brass mantel clock and the scrape of a stiff bristled broom against the floorboards. 3 days had passed since Evelyn Vance arrived at the Sterling Ranch, and in that time the mountain had done its best to freeze them out. The temperature had plummeted, turning the windows into opaque sheets of frost. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, strong coffee, and unspoken boundaries. Wyatt sat at the heavy pine table, running an oiled rag over the disassembled parts of his Colt revolver. He didn't look up, but he tracked her every movement. He was waiting for her to break. The women he had known, the few he had encountered in Copper Creek, would have been weeping by now. The chores he had assigned her were grueling, meant for a seasoned ranch hand, not a frail widow. She hauled water from the half-frozen creek, her knuckles turning raw and red. She scrubbed the cast-iron pots with sand. She hauled firewood from the shed until her woolen shawl was dusted with snow and bark. Yet, Evelyn hadn't uttered a single word of complaint. Worse, she was impossibly efficient. Wyatt had expected burned meals and silent tears. Instead, he woke before dawn to find the stove already radiating heat, his coffee boiled to pitch-black perfection, and his heavy work gloves resting precisely on the warming stone. She moved around the cabin with a quiet, terrifying grace, never intruding on his space, never asking for conversation. It infuriated him. It intrigued him. Shh, scrape. Wyatt's jaw tightened. He snapped the cylinder back into his revolver with a sharp clack. "You don't have to sweep the same boards 3 times, Mrs. Vance." Evelyn paused. She leaned on the broom handle, the drab gray fabric of her dress pooling around her scuffed boots. She didn't look at him directly, keeping her chin dipped in that submissive posture she wore like a second skin. Just ensuring the dust is settled, Mr. Sterling. It's a ranch house, not a parlor in Boston. It'll be dirty again in an hour. He shoved the gun into its holster and stood, his massive frame dwarfing the room. I'm going out to check the perimeter. The storm knocked a section of the northern fence loose. Keep the fire stoked. Yes, sir, she murmured. Wyatt grabbed his heavy sheepskin coat and his lever-action rifle from the pegs by the door. He stepped out into the blinding glare of the snow-covered valley, pulling the door shut with a heavy thud. Inside, Evelyn immediately dropped the broom. She walked to the frosted window, rubbing a small circle in the ice to watch Wyatt's broad back disappear toward the tree line. The submissive slump in her shoulders vanished, replaced by a coiled tension. For 3 days she had played the perfect, terrified bride. It was exhausting but necessary. Blackwood's men wouldn't expect to find her scrubbing floors in the Bitterroot Mountains, but she knew they were looking. She turned away from the window and went to the heavy Winchester rifle mounted above the mantel. Wyatt had left it behind, taking his older repeating rifle instead. She reached up, running a thumb over the polished walnut stock, checking the action with a quick practiced slide. Fully loaded. Good. An hour passed. The sun began its early descent behind the jagged peaks, painting the snowfields in bruised shades of purple and gold. Suddenly a sound pierced the stillness, a frantic, high-pitched bleating from the edge of the pasture. Evelyn moved to the window. Down by the broken fence line, a stray winter calf had wandered too far into the deep drifts. But that wasn't what made Evelyn's blood run cold. Emerging from the shadows of the pines was a massive timber wolf. It was gaunt, starved by the early winter, and desperate. Its yellow eyes were locked on the thrashing calf. From the opposite side of the clearing, Wyatt appeared. He was shouting, waving his arms to draw the predator's attention away from the livestock. He waded through the waist-deep snow, raising his repeating rifle to his shoulder. Evelyn watched through the glass, her breath catching. Wyatt aimed and pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing happened. The extreme cold, combined with lingering moisture in the chamber, had frozen the firing pin. Wyatt cursed, racking the lever violently to chamber another round, but the action jammed. The wolf pivoted. Realizing the man was unarmed and struggling in the deep snow, the starving beast lowered its head, baring its teeth, and changed its target. It charged straight for Wyatt. Evelyn didn't think. Instinct, honed by months of running for her life, took over. She ripped the heavy Winchester from the wall mount. She kicked the cabin door open, the freezing wind whipping her hair across her face. She didn't bother with a coat. She stepped barefoot onto the icy planks of the porch. Down in the clearing, the wolf lunged, closing the distance to Wyatt in terrifying, leaping bounds. Wyatt braced himself, gripping his jammed rifle by the barrel like a club, ready to take the animal's jaws head-on. Evelyn brought the Winchester to her shoulder. She didn't close one eye. She didn't hesitate. She exhaled, letting her lungs empty, finding the space between heartbeats. Boom! The gunshot echoed off the mountains like a thunderclap, violently shattering the quiet of the valley. The timber wolf collapsed mid-leap, tumbling into the snowbank just 10 feet from where Wyatt stood. It didn't twitch. A single perfect shot directly behind the shoulder. Down in the snow, Wyatt stood frozen, his chest heaving. He stared at the dead predator, then slowly turned his head toward the cabin. Through the drifting gun smoke, he saw her. Evelyn was standing on the porch, the biting wind tearing at her thin dress. The heavy Winchester was still pressed firmly against her shoulder. She wasn't holding it like a frightened woman who had gotten lucky. Her stance was perfectly balanced, her grip professional, the barrel completely steady. Slowly she lowered the weapon. The facade of the frail, submissive widow tried to rush back onto her face, but it was too late. He had seen it. Wyatt trudged back to the cabin, kicking the snow off his boots as he stepped onto the porch. He stopped inches from her, his towering shadow falling over her face. He looked at the smoking rifle, then down into her hazel eyes. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was loud with unspoken questions. "That was a 100-yard shot," Wyatt said, his voice dangerously low. "With a crosswind." Evelyn swallowed hard, clutching the rifle to her chest, trying to manufacture a tremble in her hands. She lowered her eyes. My late husband, Mr. Sterling. He was a hunting instructor in Ohio. He insisted I learn. Wyatt stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. His pale eyes stripped away the drab dress, the pinned-back hair, the quiet demeanor. He smelled the ozone and gunpowder in the air. He saw the cold, calculated survival in her posture. "A hunting instructor," Wyatt repeated, the words dripping with absolute disbelief. "Yes," she whispered. Wyatt reached out and took the heavy Winchester from her hands. His calloused fingers brushed hers, sending an electric shock of heat through the freezing air. "Go inside, Mrs. Vance," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers, "before you catch your death." Evelyn turned and fled into the warmth of the cabin. Wyatt stood on the porch alone, looking out at the dead wolf staining the snow red. A hunting instructor, he thought, his jaw clenching. He didn't know who this woman was or what she was running from. But as he looked back at the closed cabin door, one thing was absolutely certain. His mail-order bride was a liar, and she was dangerous. Thwack! The heavy iron axe head bit deep into the pine round, splitting it cleanly in two. Wyatt wrenched the handle free, his breath pluming in the freezing morning air. He tossed the split wood onto the growing pile and reached for another log. Thwack! It had been a week since the wolf. A week since Evelyn Vance had shattered the quiet of the valley and the fragile illusion of who she was. Wyatt swung the axe harder than necessary, the muscles in his back and shoulders burning under his flannel shirt. He was trying to exhaust himself. He was trying to chop away the memory of her standing on that porch, the smoking Winchester pressed to her shoulder, her eyes entirely devoid of fear. A hunting instructor. He snorted, his breath creating a white cloud that quickly vanished in the biting wind. It was a lie, a smooth, desperate lie. A woman taught by a husband might know how to hit a target, but she wouldn't know how to control her breathing in the face of a charging predator. She wouldn't know how to silence her panic. That kind of ice in the veins was earned through survival. He should send her back to Copper Creek. He should put her on the next train east and wash his hands of whatever trouble she was bringing to his doorstep. But as he hoisted another log, his eyes flicked unbidden toward the cabin window. Through the frosted glass, he could see the amber glow of the oil lamp and her slender silhouette moving gracefully around the kitchen. He didn't want to send her back. That was the most dangerous truth of all. Wyatt drove the axe into the chopping block, leaving it buried deep. He gathered an armful of wood and tramped up the porch steps, kicking the snow from his boots. When he pushed the door open, a wave of warmth washed over him. The cabin smelled of frying bacon, roasted coffee, and the faint, clean scent of lye soap that seemed to follow her everywhere. Evelyn was at the stove, her dark hair pinned back, a flour-dusted apron tied around her narrow waist. She didn't flinch when the heavy door slammed shut. She had learned his rhythms. "Breakfast is nearly ready, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice maintaining that soft, even cadence she used like a shield. Wyatt dumped the wood into the bin by the hearth. "I told you to call me Wyatt." Evelyn paused, the wooden spoon stalling in the iron skillet. "Wyatt," she corrected softly. He moved to the wash basin, scrubbing the sap and dirt from his hands. As he dried them on a rough towel, he watched her. The silent dance between them had shifted over the past week. The oppressive, freezing distance he had demanded on their first day was beginning to thaw, replaced by a simmering, unspoken tension that made the small cabin feel suffocatingly tight. She had stopped keeping her eyes glued to the floorboards. Now, when she handed him his plate, she met his gaze. She poured his coffee, black, just the way he liked it, and set it on the table. Wyatt sat down. As she reached across him to set down a plate of biscuits, the fabric of her sleeve brushed against his bare forearm. Wyatt went utterly still. Evelyn froze too. She was so close he could see the pulse beating frantically at the base of her throat. For a long, agonizing second, neither of them moved. The air in the kitchen grew heavy, thick with the sudden, violent awareness of the space between them. "The chair," Wyatt said suddenly, his voice rougher than he intended. Evelyn blinked, pulling back slightly. "Excuse me?" Wyatt cleared his throat, staring down at his coffee. "The chair you sit in. The back right leg is shorter than the rest. It wobbles when you lean." Evelyn looked at the chair opposite him. She had noticed it, of course, but she would never have complained. "It's fine, Mr. Wyatt. It serves its purpose." "I'll fix it today," he muttered, picking up his fork. It was a small concession, but in the harsh language of Wyatt Sterling, it was practically a poem. Evelyn sat down, her hazel eyes studying him carefully over the rim of her tin cup. The rest of the day passed in their usual, industrious silence, but the cracks in the ice were multiplying. That afternoon, while Wyatt was out in the barn, Evelyn went to the woodshed to fetch kindling. She stopped in the doorway, staring at the woodpile. For the past week, she had struggled to lift the heaviest oak rounds, scraping her knuckles and straining her back to pull them from the bottom of the stack. Today, the pile had been completely rearranged. The heaviest, thickest logs were now neatly stacked exactly at her waist height, requiring no bending or straining. The smaller kindling was arranged in a basket right by the door. She reached out, running her hand over the rough bark of an oak round. A strange, tight feeling blossomed in her chest. Her late husband, the man who had supposedly taught her to shoot, had never once noticed if a chair wobbled or if a task was too heavy for her. He had only ever seen her as an accessory. Wyatt Sterling, the gruff, unsmiling rancher who had promised her nothing but a cold partnership, was paying attention. He saw her. By the time the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the valley in bruised purples, Wyatt returned to the cabin. He hung his coat and walked over to the table. Evelyn watched as he turned her chair upside down, produced a whittling knife and a small wedge of pine, and expertly leveled the uneven leg. He set it upright. "Try it." Evelyn sat. The chair held perfectly steady. She looked up at him, the flickering firelight catching the gold in her eyes. "Thank you, Wyatt." He didn't step back. He stood over her, his thumbs hooked into his gun belt, his pale eyes searching her face. "You don't have to keep pretending with me, Evelyn." Her breath hitched at the sound of her first name on his lips. "I don't know what you mean." "The wolf. The way you handle yourself." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper. "I don't care what you're running from. But out here, secrets get people killed. If trouble is coming up this mountain, I need to know." Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to tell him. She looked at his broad chest, his scarred hands, the fierce protection radiating from him, and she wanted to lay the whole ugly truth at his feet. But she couldn't. Not yet. Blackwood was a monster who destroyed everything he touched. If Wyatt knew the full extent of the danger she carried, he would be legally implicated. She had to protect him from her own mess. "There's no trouble, Wyatt," she lied smoothly, forcing her voice to remain calm. "I am just adaptable." Wyatt stared at her for a long moment, the muscle in his jaw ticking. He knew she was lying, but he also knew he couldn't force a wild thing out of its corner. "Right," he said, finally stepping away. "I'm going to check the stock one last time before dark. Lock the door behind me." When he left, the cabin felt suddenly, overwhelmingly empty. Evelyn waited until she saw his lantern light bobbing toward the barn. Then she moved quickly. She went into her small bedroom and closed the door. She knelt beside the battered leather trunk at the foot of her bed. Her fingers traced the edge of the brass lock, finding the hidden release mechanism she had installed herself. With a soft click, the false bottom of the trunk popped loose. Evelyn lifted the wooden panel. Beneath her meager collection of spare dresses lay a thick leather-bound ledger, a stack of heavily redacted territorial maps, and a collection of legal documents stamped with federal seals. She pulled the ledger out, opening it to a page marked with a red ribbon. There it was, written in stark black ink. Josiah Blackwood, Northern Pacific Right-of-Way Acquisitions. Next to it was a list of ranches, properties, and names. Half of the names were crossed out with a single brutal line. Below them was a map of the Bitterroot Valley with Copper Creek circled in heavy black graphite. Evelyn's fingers tightened on the ledger, her knuckles turning white. "You aren't going to win this time, Josiah," she whispered to the empty room, her hazel eyes burning with a cold, terrifying fire. "I'll see you hang before I let you take this mountain." She slipped the ledger back into the hidden compartment, shutting the false bottom just as the sound of Wyatt's heavy boots echoed on the front porch. The storm outside was brewing, but the real danger was already inside the cabin. The ancient ponderosa pines groaned, a deep structural distress that echoed across the Bitterroot Valley. Wyatt Sterling knew that sound. It was the mountain clearing its throat before it screamed. He tied off the heavy gauge wire on the northern fence line, his bare fingers numb and clumsy. The sky above the jagged canopy hadn't just darkened. It had bruised, turning a sickening shade of violet black that swallowed the midday sun whole. Then the temperature simply dropped out of the world. The wind hit first, a physical, shrieking wall of ice that nearly knocked Wyatt off his feet. The snow followed instantly, not falling but firing sideways like a volley of white grape shot. Within seconds, the tree line 50 yards away vanished into a blinding, disorienting whiteout. "Hyah!" Wyatt shouted, grabbing the reins of his gelding, aiming to lead the panicked horse back to the barn. But the wind snatched the sound from his throat. He took 2 steps when he heard a sound louder than the gale. It was a sharp, violent crack, like cannon fire directly overhead. Wyatt looked up just in time to see a massive, ice-laden pine branch, thick as a whiskey barrel and heavy as iron, plummeting from the canopy. He lunged backward, but the deep snow trapped his boots. The branch slammed into the earth with a seismic thud, catching Wyatt's right leg below the knee. The pain was absolute. It was a blinding, white-hot flash that drove Wyatt face first into the snowbank, stealing the breath from his lungs. He didn't scream. His throat was paralyzed by the sheer agony radiating from his crushed tibia. He clawed at the frozen earth, gasping for air that felt like inhaled glass. Gritting his teeth, he pushed himself up on his elbows and looked back. His leg was pinned securely beneath hundreds of pounds of frozen timber. "Come on," he grunted, the words a raw rasp. He dug his gloved hands under the bark, straining his massive shoulders, his muscles bunching as he tried to lift the dead weight. The branch didn't budge a fraction of an inch. Above him, the blizzard intensified, burying him alive under a rapidly accumulating blanket of white. The cold began its insidious work, seeping through his sheepskin coat, turning the burning agony in his leg into a terrifying, spreading numbness. Wyatt dropped his head back into the snow, his vision swimming. He had survived rustlers, stampedes, and a broken heart. But the mountain always won in the end. He closed his eyes, the roar of the wind beginning to sound like a lullaby. Inside the cabin, the heavy oak door rattled fiercely against its iron hinges. Evelyn stood by the frosted window, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She couldn't see the barn. She couldn't see the porch railing. The world outside was a violent, swirling void. Wyatt had been gone for 3 hours. She paced the length of the kitchen, her hands twisting her flour-dusted apron. A man caught in a whiteout this severe wouldn't last the afternoon. He would lose his bearings, walk in circles, and freeze to death 100 yards from his own front door. She didn't hesitate. Evelyn threw off her apron and ran to the pegs by the door. She pulled Wyatt's spare canvas duster off the hook, slipping it over her dress. It was comically large, the hem dragging on the floor, but it was heavy and lined with wool. She wrapped a thick woolen scarf around her head and face, leaving only a slit for her eyes. She grabbed a coiled length of hemp rope and a heavy iron lantern, striking a match to light the wick. She shoved the door open. The wind threw her backward, but she dropped her shoulder and pushed through, forcing the heavy oak shut behind her. The cold was a physical blow. Evelyn gasped, the icy air searing her lungs. She tied one end of the rope around the porch post and the other around her waist. She couldn't see the barn, but she knew the northern fence line started just past the woodpile. One step, she told herself, leaning into the gale, then another. She waded through waist-deep drifts, using the top wire of the fence to guide her. The lantern light barely pierced the blinding snow. Her fingers, even inside her leather gloves, were growing dangerously numb. "Wyatt!" she screamed, her voice instantly swallowed by the shrieking wind. She kept moving, her legs burning with exhaustion. She had survived the syndicate's assassins. She wasn't going to let this stubborn rancher die in the snow. Nearly half a mile from the cabin, her boot struck something soft. Evelyn dropped to her knees, holding the lantern close to the snow. Wyatt lay motionless, his face pale and crusted with ice, his right leg trapped beneath a monstrous pine limb. "Wyatt!" She frantically brushed the snow from his face, slapping his freezing cheek. "Look at me! Open your eyes!" His eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes that were dull and glassy. "Evie," he mumbled, his jaw locked with the cold. "Too heavy. Go back." "I am not leaving you here to die, Wyatt Sterling," she shouted over the storm. She scrambled to the crushed leg. Wyatt had the raw strength, but he had panicked. Evelyn had an analytical mind. She didn't try to lift the impossible weight. Instead, she looked around the blinding whiteout, spotting a loose, sturdy cedar fence post half buried in the snow, and a large, flat granite rock near his boot. She dragged the rock tight against the fallen tree limb. Then she jammed the sturdy cedar post under the pine branch, resting it directly across the rock to create a fulcrum. "Wyatt!" she yelled, crawling to his chest and grabbing his coat lapels. "When I push down on this post, the log is going to lift. It will only be an inch. You have to pull your leg out. Do you understand?" He gave a weak, agonizing nod. Evelyn scrambled to the high end of the cedar lever. She threw her entire body weight onto it. Physics and sheer desperate will went to work. The cedar post bowed, groaning under the strain. Slowly, agonizingly, the massive pine branch lifted just an inch. Wyatt unleashed a guttural roar of pain and dragged his body backward. His mangled leg slid free just as the cedar post snapped in half with a sharp crack, dropping the heavy pine back into the snow. Evelyn didn't waste a second. She hooked her arms under his broad shoulders. He was dead weight, easily twice her size. But adrenaline fueled her muscles. Step by agonizing step, using the fence line as a guide, she dragged him through the drifts. The journey back was a blur of burning lungs, blinding white, and Wyatt's ragged breathing. By the time she kicked the cabin door open and hauled him over the threshold, Evelyn was operating on pure survival instinct. She kicked the door shut, cutting off the shriek of the storm. The sudden quiet of the cabin was deafening. She dragged Wyatt toward the roaring hearth, her own body trembling violently as she stripped off the snow-caked canvas duster. Wyatt was semi-conscious, shivering uncontrollably on the rug. His breathing was shallow. Evelyn didn't cry. She didn't panic. She moved with a cold, terrifying precision. She grabbed her shears from the sewing kit and swiftly cut away the heavy blood-soaked canvas of his right trouser leg. The sight was grisly. The bone hadn't fully broken the skin, but the fracture was severe, the flesh already swelling into a dark, angry purple, torn by the rough bark of the tree. Through the haze of his agony and hypothermia, Wyatt forced his eyes open. The cabin spun in dizzying circles. He expected to see a terrified widow weeping over him. Instead, he saw Evelyn calmly walking back from her bedroom, carrying her battered leather trunk. She set it beside him and flipped the false bottom open. Wyatt's blurry vision caught sight of gleaming glass and metal. She didn't pull out knitting needles or bandages. She retrieved a dark, amber glass bottle, the label marked clearly with acidum carbolicum, a potent, high-grade antiseptic used only in professional medical settings to prevent gangrene. Beside it, she laid out a small vial of laudanum, and finally a gleaming, perfectly honed surgical scalpel. Wyatt watched her uncap the carbolic acid, the sharp, medicinal scent cutting through the smell of wood smoke. Her hands weren't shaking. Her eyes were completely focused, calculating the dosage and the trajectory of the wound, with the clinical detachment of a battlefield surgeon. "Hold still, Wyatt," she said, her voice steady as iron. "This is going to burn." As the blinding sting of the antiseptic hit his torn flesh, Wyatt looked up into the fierce, unyielding eyes of his mail-order bride. His last coherent thought before the darkness finally pulled him under wasn't about the pain, or the blizzard, or the broken leg. It was the sudden, undeniable realization that the woman saving his life was a ghost, running from a war he knew nothing about. The iron kettle shrieked, a high, thin whistle that pierced the suffocating heat of the cabin. Wyatt Sterling was burning alive. He floated in a dark, agonizing purgatory, anchored to the physical world only by the rhythmic, agonizing throb in his right leg and the scent of carbolic acid. Time had lost its meaning. He didn't know if it had been hours or days since the pine branch crushed him in the snow. Through the haze of his fever, he felt small, cool hands pressing a damp cloth to his forehead. He felt the bitter, earthy sting of willow bark tea and laudanum being coaxed past his cracked lips. He heard the rustle of a skirt, the heavy clunk of firewood being fed into the stove, and the relentless howling of the wind battering the thick log walls. For the first time in his adult life, Wyatt was entirely helpless. The terrifying isolation he had built around himself had become his prison, and the frail widow he had hired to sweep his floors was his only warden. It was the third night after the blizzard when the fever finally peaked. The storm outside had died, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt like the end of the world. Inside the cabin, the hearth fire had burned down to deep glowing red embers, casting long dancing shadows across the ceiling. Wyatt lay on a makeshift pallet dragged close to the fire. His heavy canvas trousers had been cut away, revealing a leg bound tightly in straight oak splints, and strips of white cotton torn directly from Evelyn's own petticoats. The swelling was massive, angry and purple, but the dark lines of infection had stopped spreading. She had saved the leg. He opened his eyes, the world swimming into a blurry gold-tinted focus. Evelyn was sitting in the wooden chair beside him. She looked terrible, and to Wyatt she had never looked more beautiful. The severe, perfect bun she always wore had fallen apart, leaving dark waves of hair cascading over her shoulders. Her face was hollowed by exhaustion, dark circles bruising the skin under her hazel eyes. She was wearing his heavy flannel shirt over her dress to ward off the chill, the sleeves rolled up past her elbows. She hadn't slept since she dragged him out of the snow. She had carried the wood, boiled the water, fought the infection, and kept the creeping death of winter at bay. Wyatt couldn't speak. His throat was like parchment. He lay perfectly still, his breathing shallow, watching her through the slits of his half-closed eyes. Evelyn leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, burying her face in her hands. A long, shuddering sigh escaped her lips, a sound of profound, unbearable exhaustion. When she lifted her head, she stared blankly into the dying embers. Believing the laudanum still had Wyatt locked in a deep, senseless sleep, the iron walls of her composure finally crumbled. "I didn't mean to bring this to your door," Evelyn whispered. Her voice was brittle, fracturing in the quiet cabin. Wyatt's pulse jumped, but he didn't move a muscle. "I saw your advertisement in the paper," she continued, speaking to the fire, needing to confess to the shadows what she could never say in the light. A man in the Bitterroots, remote, isolated, asking for a quiet wife and offering a legally binding name. It was the perfect place to vanish. She reached out, gently pulling the heavy wool blanket higher over Wyatt's broad chest, her knuckles brushing his collarbone. "My name is Evelyn Vance, but my husband wasn't a hunting instructor." A bitter, humorless smile touched her lips. "Thomas was an auditor, a good man, a naive man. We worked for a corporate law firm in Chicago, handling land disputes for the Northern Pacific Railroad." Wyatt's mind sharpened, fighting through the thick fog of the opiates. The railroad. Every rancher in the territory knew the railroad meant blood and stolen land. "Josiah Blackwood," Evelyn whispered, the name dropping from her lips like poison. "He's a land baron running the right-of-way acquisitions. Thomas found the discrepancies. He found out Blackwood was using forged territorial seals to seize homesteads, bankrupting families, driving them off their land, and selling it back to the railroad for a fortune." She paused, her throat clicking as she swallowed hard. Thomas thought the law mattered. He took the evidence to the local magistrate. Evelyn's voice dropped to a trembling husk. They pulled Thomas from the river 3 days later. The police called it a robbery gone wrong. Wyatt felt a cold rage ignite in his chest, burning hotter than his fever. "I knew I was next," Evelyn said, wiping a single silent tear from her cheek with the back of her hand. "Blackwood's men ransacked our apartment, but they didn't find the master ledgers. I had already taken them. I packed them in the false bottom of my trunk, bought a second-hand Derringer, and got on the first train heading west to answer your letter." She leaned back in the chair, looking down at Wyatt's pale, sweat-sheened face. "I am a fugitive, Wyatt. I'm a dead woman carrying a box full of ghosts." She let out a ragged breath. "I thought I could just hide here, be your quiet housekeeper, but Blackwood's syndicate is moving into the Bitterroot Valley. I saw their mark on the saddle of those riders you chased off last month. They're coming for this land, and if they find me here, they will kill you too." Evelyn stood up, the chair scraping softly against the floorboards. She looked around the cabin, at the mended chair, the stacked wood, the life they had forged in the suffocating silence of the past few weeks. "As soon as you can walk," she whispered, her voice breaking completely, "I will leave. I'll take the ledgers and draw them away. I promise you, Wyatt, you won't lose your ranch because of me." She turned away, stepping toward the kitchen basin to fetch another cold cloth for his brow. She didn't make it 2 steps. A massive, calloused hand suddenly shot out from beneath the wool blankets. Wyatt's fingers locked around her slender wrist like an iron vice. Evelyn gasped, spinning around. Wyatt's pale eyes were wide open. The glassy sheen of the fever had burned away, leaving behind a sharp, terrifying clarity. He gripped her wrist not with anger, but with an anchoring, desperate strength. He pulled her slightly closer, fighting through the agonizing pain in his leg to lift his head off the pillow. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. "Wyatt, you're awake. The laudanum." "I heard you," Wyatt interrupted, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sent a shiver straight down her spine. He didn't let go of her wrist. Instead, his thumb shifted, pressing gently against her racing pulse. He looked at the dark circles under her eyes, the fierce intelligence she had hidden for so long, and the terrifying burden she had carried entirely alone. "I'm still listening, Evelyn," Wyatt murmured, his grip tightening. "And nobody is leaving this mountain." The ice was finally breaking. Not the snowpack outside the cabin, but the glacial wall that had stood between Wyatt Sterling and his mail-order bride. 2 weeks had passed since the night the fever broke. 2 weeks of brutal, agonizing recovery. Wyatt's leg was healing, bound tightly in oak splints, and he refused to stay bedridden a day longer than necessary. He had whittled a heavy crutch from a thick pine branch, and with Evelyn's shoulder under his arm, he forced himself to walk the length of the cabin. The silence between them was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous: absolute honesty. Evelyn had shown him the stolen ledgers. They spent the long winter evenings at the pine table, the oil lamp burning low as she deciphered the intricate web of Josiah Blackwood's corporate theft. Wyatt listened, mesmerized not just by the scale of the corruption, but by the brilliant, razor-sharp mind of the woman sitting across from him. The timid widow was dead. In her place was a fierce, calculating survivor, and Wyatt had never been so captivated by anything in his life. "Step," Evelyn coaxed gently, her arm wrapped firmly around his waist as they navigated the space between the table and the hearth. Wyatt gritted his teeth, shifting his weight onto the makeshift crutch. His muscles trembled with the effort, his breath coming in a harsh rasp. "I'm heavy, Evelyn. Let me rest." "You're stubborn is what you are," she replied, though a soft, genuine smile played at the corners of her lips. "One more step to the chair, Wyatt. You can do it." He managed the final stride, leaning heavily on her before pivoting to lower himself into the wooden armchair. But as he turned, his crutch slipped on the smooth floorboards. Wyatt caught his balance, but the sudden shift threw Evelyn against his chest. He instinctively dropped the crutch, wrapping both of his massive arms around her waist to keep her from falling. The impact knocked the breath from them both. Suddenly, the world reduced itself to the heavy thud of their racing hearts. Evelyn was pressed flush against him, her hands resting flat against the hard planes of his chest. She looked up, her hazel eyes wide, the gold flecks in them illuminated by the flickering firelight. Wyatt's pale eyes darkened. He didn't let her go. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin, smell the scent of lye soap, and the faint, sweet trace of vanilla she kept in the kitchen. For 5 years, Wyatt had starved himself of human touch. Now, holding the woman who had dragged him from the snow, fought his fever, and trusted him with her life, the dam finally gave way. "Wyatt," she breathed, the word a fragile question. "I told you I'd protect you," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated against her palms. He lifted one calloused hand, his rough fingertips gently tracing the curve of her jaw, pushing a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear. "But I never figured out who was supposed to protect me from you." Evelyn's breath hitched. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. Wyatt lowered his head, his mouth capturing hers. It wasn't a gentle, polite kiss. It was desperate, bruising, and fueled by weeks of unspoken longing and the adrenaline of sheer survival. Evelyn answered it with equal ferocity, her fingers twisting into the fabric of his flannel shirt, pulling him closer. The kiss tasted like coffee, wood smoke, and salvation. All the cold contracts and polite boundaries incinerated in the heat of that single moment. But the frontier rarely allows for peace. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The heavy, unmistakable sound of horses' hooves breaking through the crusted snow outside shattered the quiet. Wyatt tore his lips from hers, his eyes snapping open. The soft, vulnerable look on his face vanished instantly, replaced by the hardened glare of a frontiersman. He reached instinctively for his gun belt hanging on the back of his chair, sliding the heavy Colt revolver into his hand. Evelyn stepped back, her chest heaving. With a fluid motion that still astonished Wyatt, she slipped the silver derringer from her sleeve and clicked the hammer back. "Stay behind me," Wyatt ordered, using the wall to pull himself upright. He limped to the heavy oak door, throwing the iron latch and pulling it open. The biting winter air rushed in, carrying the smell of unwashed horses and cheap tobacco. 2 men sat on horseback 20 yards from the porch. They wore heavy canvas dusters and bowler hats, city men playing at being cowboys. Wyatt recognized the insignia branded into the leather of their saddles, an intertwined N and P, the Northern Pacific. Blackwood's hounds had found them. "Wyatt Sterling," the lead rider called out, his breath pluming in the cold. He had a sneer permanently etched into his scarred face. "We represent the Territorial Land Commission." "You represent a thief," Wyatt barked, leveling the Colt directly at the man's chest. "You're trespassing on private land. Turn those horses around." The rider chuckled, reaching inside his coat. Wyatt thumbed the hammer of his Colt, but the man only produced a folded piece of thick, wax-sealed parchment. "Actually, Mr. Sterling, you're the one trespassing," the man sneered. "We hold a federal eviction notice. Your claim was never properly registered with the Territorial Office under the Homestead Act. This land is slated for railroad right-of-way. You have 24 hours to vacate, or you'll be removed by force." Wyatt's grip tightened on his gun. He was ready to start shooting. He didn't care about the law. This was his dirt. But before he could pull the trigger, Evelyn stepped out onto the porch. She didn't look like a cowering wife. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, the derringer held casually but expertly at her side. "Let me see that paper," she commanded, her voice ringing out across the snow with the crisp, authoritative bite of a seasoned litigator. The 2 riders exchanged a confused glance. "Who are you?" the second rider grunted. "I am Mrs. Evelyn Sterling, legal co-owner of this property," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Bring the document here, slowly." The lead rider sneered but nudged his horse forward, tossing the folded parchment onto the snow at the edge of the porch. Evelyn stepped down, picked it up, and broke the wax seal. She scanned the document, her eyes darting over the legal jargon she knew better than the back of her hand. Then she laughed. It was a cold, mocking sound. "You boys are a long way from Chicago," Evelyn said, looking up at them with absolute contempt. She held the document up in the freezing air. "This cites the Homestead Act amendments of 1879. But you missed a critical detail. Federal land patents issued for right-of-way acquisitions after 1875 are stamped with carmine red ink." She pointed to the bottom of the page. "This seal is County Clerk Black. Furthermore, the signature belongs to Judge Brennan, whose jurisdiction ends at the county line 50 miles east of here. This isn't a federal order. This is a poorly forged piece of trash." The lead rider's sneer vanished, his face draining of color. He looked from the fierce woman with the derringer to the massive rancher aiming a Colt at his head. This was supposed to be a simple intimidation job on an ignorant squatter. "Tear it up, Evie," Wyatt said softly, his eyes never leaving the rider's. Evelyn ripped the forged document cleanly in half, then into quarters, letting the pieces flutter down into the snow like dead leaves. "Tell Josiah Blackwood," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with venom, "that if he wants this valley, he's going to have to do better than sending his illiterate errand boys with fake paperwork." The men yanked their reins, their horses dancing nervously in the snow. "You're making a mistake, lady," the lead rider spat. "The railroad takes what it wants. You just signed your own death warrants." "Get off my land," Wyatt roared, firing a warning shot into the snow just inches from the lead horse's hooves. The horses reared, and the two men spurred them hard, galloping back down the mountain trail, disappearing into the dark tree line. The echoing crack of the gunshot faded, leaving the valley in a deafening silence. Evelyn stood on the edge of the porch, her adrenaline crashing. She swayed slightly, and Wyatt was instantly there. He dropped his Colt into its holster and wrapped his good arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. She leaned her head against his broad shoulder, her breathing ragged. "They know I'm here now, Wyatt. Blackwood knows?" Wyatt stared out at the dark, jagged silhouette of the Bitterroot Peaks. The cold logic of the frontier settled heavily over him. Evelyn had beaten them with the law today, but men like Josiah Blackwood didn't care about the law when the sun went down. "They aren't going to a judge," Wyatt said grimly, his arm tightening around her, pulling her back into the safety of the cabin. "They're coming back with torches." The night did not fall over the Bitterroot Valley. It descended like a suffocating woolen blanket, thick and heavy with the promise of violence. Inside the Sterling cabin, the hearth fire had been smothered down to a low, sullen glow. Light was a liability now. Every illuminated window was a target, a beacon for the men Josiah Blackwood would inevitably send into the dark. Wyatt sat in the center of the room, his bad leg propped straight out on a wooden stool. The oak splints dug uncomfortably into his calf, a constant throbbing reminder of his physical limits. But his hands were perfectly steady. Spread across the heavy pine table before him was an arsenal that spoke of a man who had tamed a violent frontier. His lever-action Winchester rifle, a double-barreled scattergun, his heavy Colt .45, and dozens of brass cartridges gleaming dully in the dim ambient light. Click, clack. Wyatt fed the thick .44-40 rounds into the loading gate of the Winchester, the mechanical sound rhythmic and cold. Beside him, Evelyn moved with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. She wasn't wringing her hands or weeping into a handkerchief. She was tearing the last of her white cotton petticoats into long, even bandages, laying them out next to the dark amber bottle of carbolic acid and the surgical scalpel. She was preparing for blood. "They won't come up the main trail," Wyatt said, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the silence of the room. He didn't look up from the rifle. "The snow is too deep in the gorge. They'll circle around the eastern ridge, come down through the tree line behind the barn. It gives them the high ground and the cover of the pines." Evelyn paused. a strip of white cotton pulled taut between her hands. She looked at the broad, rigid set of his shoulders. For 5 years, Wyatt Sterling had fought to keep the world out. Now, because of her, the worst of the world was clawing at his door. "Wyatt," she said softly, stepping closer to the table. The smell of gun oil and cold iron clung to him. "If this goes badly, if they breach the cabin—" "They won't," he interrupted, snapping the lever of the Winchester down and back up to chamber a round. He engaged the half-cock safety and set the heavy rifle on the table. Only then did he look up at her. His pale eyes were entirely devoid of fear, but they were dark with a fierce, possessive intensity that made Evelyn's breath catch in her throat. "I need you to promise me," Evelyn insisted, her voice trembling just enough to betray the iron facade she wore. She reached into the pocket of her woolen skirt and pulled out the thick, leather-bound ledger, the undeniable proof of Blackwood's empire of theft and murder. "If I fall, or if they pin us down, you take this. You take my horse and you ride north to the marshal in Missoula. You don't look back. You let me be the distraction." Wyatt stared at the ledger, then slowly shifted his gaze up to her face. The dancing shadows of the dying fire hollowed her cheeks, highlighting the exhaustion she had endured since the blizzard. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand wrapping completely over her smaller, trembling fingers, pushing the ledger down against the tabletop. "I made a vow on a freezing train platform in Copper Creek," Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that vibrated in the quiet room. "I told you I would protect you. I didn't say I'd protect a book, Evelyn. I don't give a damn about the Northern Pacific Railroad, and I don't give a damn about Josiah Blackwood's stolen dirt. I care about what's standing in my kitchen." Evelyn's throat tightened, a sudden fear stinging behind her eyes. "Wyatt, they killed my husband for this. They will butcher you just to get to me." "Let them try," Wyatt murmured, his grip on her hand tightening, anchoring her to him. He pulled her slightly closer, his thumb brushing over the bruised knuckles of her right hand, knuckles she had scraped raw hauling his firewood. "I spent 5 years trying to be a ghost, Evie. I thought if I didn't care about anything, nothing could ever hurt me again. You walked into this cabin and dragged me back to the living. I am not letting you die in the snow." He released her hand and reached up, his rough fingertips tracing the line of her jaw. It was a fleeting, desperately tender touch amidst the cold steel and impending violence. "Load your Derringer," he commanded softly, the tenderness vanishing, replaced by the hardened steel of a frontiersman. "Keep it hidden. If a man gets close enough to touch you, you aim for the center of his chest and you don't hesitate. Understand?" Evelyn nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. With a fluid, practiced motion, she slid the silver weapon from her sleeve, checked the twin brass cartridges in the breech, and snapped it shut with a definitive click. "I understand." They plunged into silence again, the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a violent storm. The mantel clock ticked away the minutes. 10 o'clock passed, then 11. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted as the fire starved, but neither moved to stoke it. They sat in the freezing gloom, listening to the wind howl around the eaves. It was shortly past midnight when the wind brought the first warning. Wyatt's head snapped up, his nostrils flaring. It was faint at first, masked by the scent of the pine needles and the frozen earth, but it was unmistakable. Kerosene. A second later, a panicked, high-pitched whinny shattered the silence of the valley. It came from the barn. "The horses!" Evelyn gasped, rushing toward the frosted window. She rubbed a clear circle through the ice. The darkness outside was suddenly violently ruptured. A brilliant, unnatural orange glow was blossoming through the slats of the heavy wooden barn doors 50 yards away. The glow intensified by the second, licking rapidly up the dry, weather-beaten pine of the structure. "They aren't hitting the cabin," Wyatt snarled, grabbing his Winchester and shoving himself up from the chair. His bad leg screamed in protest, a white-hot lance of pain shooting from his calf to his hip, but adrenaline drowned it out. They're burning the barn. They know we have to come out to save the stock. It's a rat trap. Wyatt, you can't walk out there. It's an ambush, Evelyn cried, turning from the window. The glow of the fire was already bright enough to cast dancing orange shadows across her terrified face. I have 4 draft horses and 2 geldings tied up in there, Evelyn. They'll burn alive in 5 minutes. Wyatt grabbed his heavy sheepskin coat, throwing it over his broad shoulders. He shoved his Colt into his holster and grabbed his makeshift pine crutch. You stay here. Bar the door behind me. Do not open it unless you hear my voice. No! Evelyn grabbed his arm, her hazel eyes blazing with a fierce, absolute defiance. She had spent her entire life letting men make decisions for her, letting men take the fall for her. Not tonight. You can't move fast enough in the snow with that leg. You're a sitting duck. I'm going with you. Evie, damn it. I have the Derringer. I can run faster than you. You lay down covering fire, and I'll throw the barn doors open. She didn't wait for his permission. She grabbed Wyatt's spare canvas duster from the peg, throwing it over her shoulders, and wrapped her woolen scarf tightly around her lower face. Wyatt stared at her, the frantic screams of the trapped horses echoing through the thick log walls. He saw the immovable resolve in her posture. There was no time to argue. The barn was a tinder box of dry hay and aged wood. It would be fully engulfed in moments. Stay low, Wyatt growled, his voice tight with fear for her. You run on my signal, and not a second before. You open those doors, you spook the herd out, and you hit the dirt. Do not try to run back to the cabin while they're shooting. Evelyn nodded, stepping up to the heavy oak door and throwing the iron latch. Ready? Wyatt asked, lifting the heavy Winchester, bracing the stock against his hip, his finger hovering over the trigger. Ready? Wyatt kicked the door open. The roar of the fire hit them instantly. The barn, 50 yards away, was a terrifying spectacle. Flames were already chewing through the shingled roof, sending massive plumes of black smoke and a blizzard of glowing orange embers spiraling into the freezing night sky. The snow-covered clearing between the cabin and the barn was illuminated in a harsh dancing hellscape of orange and black. It was exactly what Blackwood's men wanted. The fire destroyed the night vision of anyone stepping out of the cabin, while perfectly backlighting them against the snow. Wyatt didn't hobble out onto the porch. He threw himself sideways, crashing heavily behind the thick wooden rain barrel at the edge of the veranda. His bad leg slammed against the frozen wood, drawing a sharp grunt of agony from his chest. He was just in time. Crack! Crack! 2 rifle shots tore through the air from the dark tree line beyond the barn. The bullets slammed into the cabin doorframe exactly where Wyatt had been standing a fraction of a second earlier, sending deadly splinters of oak flying into the dark. Down! Wyatt roared at Evelyn, who had thrown herself flat against the porch floorboards. Wyatt peered around the edge of the rain barrel. He couldn't see the shooters in the pitch-black pines, but he didn't need to. He was a creature of the frontier. He knew the terrain, he knew the angles, and he knew how to read the flashes. Crack! A third muzzle flash blossomed from a cluster of boulders to the left of the blazing barn. Wyatt brought the Winchester to his shoulder. He didn't aim. He operated on pure, ingrained muscle memory. He exhaled, pulling the trigger. The rifle bucked violently against his shoulder. He instantly racked the lever, the spent brass casing spinning away into the snow, and fired again. Boom! Boom! His heavy .44-40 rounds chewed into the boulders, showering the hidden shooter with fragments of granite. A man screamed in the darkness, the sound quickly drowned out by the roaring inferno of the barn. I've got 3 on the left, maybe 2 on the ridge, Wyatt shouted over the chaos, chambering another round. They're trying to pin us down while the roof collapses. Evie, wait! But the screams of the horses had reached a fever pitch of pure animalistic terror. The smell of burning hair and roasting flesh was beginning to taint the air. Evelyn couldn't wait. As Wyatt laid down a blistering barrage of suppressing fire, racking the lever of the Winchester so fast the barrel began to smoke, Evelyn scrambled off the edge of the porch. She hit the waist-deep snow and didn't try to run upright. She practically crawled, using the deep drifts as a trench, her oversized canvas coat blending in with the chaotic shadows cast by the leaping flames. "Evelyn!" Wyatt roared, his heart plummeting into his stomach. He abandoned his cover, stepping out into the open to draw their fire away from her. He stood tall, a massive silhouette against the cabin, his bad legs screaming as it took his full weight. He fired relentlessly into the tree line. Boom, clack, boom, clack. He shot at every shadow that moved, every glint of metal, forcing Blackwood's men to keep their heads down in the snow. Evelyn reached the front of the barn. The heat was immense, a physical wall that blistered her exposed skin and singed her eyebrows. The massive double doors were barred from the outside with a heavy wooden beam. Blackwood's men had trapped the animals intentionally. She grabbed the beam, her leather gloves smoking instantly as they touched the superheated wood. She screamed, a raw sound of exertion and pain, throwing her entire body weight upward. The beam groaned, shifting out of its iron brackets, and fell to the snow with a heavy thud. Evelyn grabbed the iron handles of the doors and hauled them backward. A wall of black smoke and searing heat exploded out of the opening. Inside, the barn was a vision of hell. The hayloft had collapsed in the center, dropping a mountain of burning debris onto the dirt floor. The 6 horses were tethered to their stalls, rearing up on their hind legs, their eyes rolling back in their heads, kicking violently at the wooden partitions. Evelyn rushed in, coughing violently as the thick smoke coated her lungs. She pulled the silver derringer from her sleeve and used the sharp metal barrel to saw frantically through the thick hemp ropes, tying the first 2 draft horses to their posts. Freed, the massive animals didn't need any urging. Blinded by panic, they bolted for the open doors, a tidal wave of muscle and terror. Outside, the sudden stampede of 2-ton draft horses charging out of the burning barn created absolute chaos. The animals scattered, running wildly toward the tree line where Blackwood's men were hiding. Wyatt used the distraction. He dropped the empty Winchester, drawing his Colt .45. He began a slow, agonizingly painful march across the clearing toward the barn, firing methodically into the trees. Inside the barn, Evelyn freed the remaining horses, slapping their flanks to send them running out into the snow. The roof above her groaned, the main support beam cracking like a cannon shot. Sparks rained down on her canvas coat like angry fireflies. She turned to sprint for the doors. Suddenly, a massive silhouette blocked the exit. It wasn't a horse. It was a man. He wore a heavy wool coat and a bowler hat pulled low. In one hand, he held an empty kerosene tin. In the other, a long-barreled Remington revolver. He had been circling the back of the barn to set a secondary fire, and the stampede had forced him to the front. He saw Evelyn through the smoke. He saw a woman alone, choking in the heat. A nasty, jagged smile split his soot-stained face. He raised the Remington, aiming directly at her chest. "Look what I found," the man sneered, his voice audible even over the roaring flames. "Blackwood said there'd be a bonus for the bitch." Evelyn didn't freeze. The timid widow from Chicago had died weeks ago. She raised her right hand, her sleeve falling back. She didn't have time to aim down the sights. She didn't have time to think. She leveled the silver derringer and pulled the trigger. The small gun bucked violently in her hand. The heavy-caliber bullet took the man dead in the right shoulder. The impact spun him around, his Remington discharging wildly into the burning roof. He fell backward into the snow with a scream of shock and agony. Evelyn ran. She bolted out of the burning barn just as the main roof beam finally gave way, collapsing the entire structure inward with a deafening, earth-shaking crash. A geyser of sparks shot 100 feet into the air, turning the night sky into a shower of falling stars. She hit the snow outside, rolling to extinguish the embers clinging to her canvas coat. A strong hand grabbed her collar, hauling her up behind a massive oak water trough just yards from the collapsed barn. It was Wyatt. His face was smeared with soot, his chest heaving, his pale eyes wild with a terror she had never seen in him before. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his hands frantically checking her shoulders, her arms grabbing her face to force her to look at him. "Evelyn, are you hit?" "I'm fine," she gasped, coughing up the acrid smoke. "The horses are out." Wyatt let out a ragged breath. pulling her flush against his chest for one agonizing, desperate second. "I told you to stay down," he growled into her hair. Before she could answer, the snow next to Wyatt's boot exploded. Zing! The ricochet whined past Evelyn's ear. Blackwood's men were regrouping. With the barn collapsed, the massive bonfire was providing perfect illumination for the gunmen hidden in the dark pines, while Wyatt and Evelyn were trapped behind the water trough in the dead center of the clearing. "They've got us pinned," Wyatt grunted, reloading his Colt with frantic blood-stained fingers. His bad leg was trembling violently, the makeshift splint beginning to crack under the strain of his movements. "There are at least 4 left. If we stay here, they'll flank us. If we run for the cabin, they'll cut us down." Evelyn crouched in the snow, her mind racing. The fire, the light. It was their enemy right now, but it could be their weapon. "Wyatt," she said, her voice dropping to a rapid, calculating whisper. "The smoke. The wind is shifting." Wyatt looked up. She was right. The bitter wind sweeping down from the Bitterroot Peaks had suddenly shifted direction. Instead of blowing the thick black smoke of the collapsed barn toward the cabin, it was pushing it in a massive, blinding wave directly toward the eastern tree line, right into the faces of the hidden gunmen. "When the smoke covers the trees, we run," Evelyn commanded, slipping her second unspent cartridge into the firing chamber of her Derringer. "My leg," Wyatt ground out, his jaw tight with shame. "I can't run, Evie. I'll slow you down. You go. I'll hold them here." Evelyn turned to him, her hazel eyes blazing with a fury that rivaled the inferno behind them. "I didn't drag you out of a blizzard to leave you to die in a firefight, Wyatt Sterling. We go together, or we die behind this trough. Put your arm around my shoulder." Wyatt stared at her. He saw the absolute finality in her expression. He nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin. He holstered his Colt, grabbed his pine crutch, and slung his massive left arm over Evelyn's shoulders. She braced herself against his crushing weight, her boots digging into the frozen mud and snow beneath them. "Wait for it," Wyatt whispered, his eyes locked on the shifting wall of smoke. The wind howled, a sudden violent gust that picked up the thick, choking cloud of burning hay and pine, and drove it straight into the eastern pines. Instantly, the tree line vanished behind a wall of impenetrable, stinging black fog. Coughing and shouting erupted from the woods as the gunmen were blinded and choked by the sudden smokescreen. "Now!" Wyatt roared. They broke from cover. It was a brutal, agonizing, 3-legged race across 50 yards of knee-deep snow. Wyatt gritted his teeth, suppressing the groans of agony as his broken leg dragged and jostled. Evelyn carried half his weight, her muscles burning, her lungs screaming for clean air. Crack! A blind shot tore through the smoke, missing them by yards. Crack! Another shot. They reached the porch. Wyatt practically threw Evelyn up the stairs, dragging himself up behind her. They spilled through the front doorway of the cabin, crashing onto the hard pine floorboards in a tangle of heavy coats and snow. Evelyn scrambled to her feet, throwing her entire weight against the heavy oak door and slamming the iron bar into place. They lay on the floor in the pitch-black cabin, bathed only by the flickering orange light bleeding through the frosted windows. Their breathing was ragged, harsh, and loud in the quiet room. Outside, the gunfire had stopped. Blackwood's men had lost their advantage. The ambush had failed. Their target was back inside a fortified log cabin. They had lost one man to a Derringer wound, and the element of surprise was gone. Slowly, the sound of retreating hoofbeats echoed through the valley, fading into the howling wind until nothing was left but the crackle and pop of the dying barn. Wyatt lay on his back, staring up at the dark ceiling. His chest heaved. His leg felt like it had been shattered all over again. But he was alive, and he could hear Evelyn breathing in the dark just inches from him. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, his pale eyes searching the gloom until he found her. She was sitting against the wall beneath the window, her knees pulled to her chest, her hands trembling violently now that the adrenaline was finally leaving her system. Her face was streaked with soot and melted snow, her hair a tangled mess smelling of smoke. Wyatt dragged himself across the floor, ignoring the white-hot pain in his leg. He reached her, pulling himself up to sit beside her against the wall. He didn't say a word. He just reached out and pulled her into his arms. Evelyn collapsed against him, burying her face in the crook of his neck. A dry, ragged sob tore from her throat. It wasn't a cry of weakness. It was the sound of a woman who had been holding her breath for 6 months, finally letting it out. Wyatt wrapped his massive arms around her, burying his face in her soot-stained hair. He held her with a fierce, desperate strength, rocking her slightly in the dark. "You're safe," he murmured into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "I've got you, Evie. I've got you." They sat like that for a long time, the cold seeping back into the cabin, the light from the burning barn slowly dying outside the window. Eventually, the trembling stopped. Evelyn pulled back slightly, looking up at him. Wyatt's face was bruised, smeared with ash, his eyes dark with an unspoken promise. He looked away from her, his gaze settling on the window. Through the frosted glass, the skeletal, smoldering ruins of the barn he had built with his own 2 hands glowed like angry embers in the snow. 5 years of labor, of isolating himself, of building a fortress against the world, had been reduced to ashes in a single hour. Evelyn followed his gaze. "Wyatt, the barn, the winter feed, the saddles. I am so sorry. I brought this to you." Wyatt stared at the ruins. For a man who measured his worth by the work of his hands and the property he held, it should have been a devastating blow. It should have broken him. Instead, a cold, terrifying calm settled over Wyatt Sterling. He didn't mourn the wood. He didn't mourn the hay. He looked at the smoking ashes, and he realized he didn't care about any of it. The walls he had built to keep the world out had also kept him trapped. Josiah Blackwood thought he could burn Wyatt out. Blackwood thought destroying a man's property would break a man's spirit. Blackwood had made a fatal miscalculation. He had given Wyatt Sterling something to fight for. Wyatt turned his head, looking back at Evelyn. His pale eyes were no longer the guarded, dead eyes of a grieving widower. They were the eyes of a predator who had just been unchained. "We have 3 horses left wandering the valley, and enough tack in the shed to rig 2 of them," Wyatt said, his voice terrifyingly calm and razor-sharp. Evelyn blinked, wiping a smudge of soot from her cheek. "Wyatt, your leg. The cabin." "What are you saying?" Wyatt reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping a tear from the corner of her eye. Then he grabbed the back of the chair, pulling his massive frame upright. He stood tall, ignoring the screaming pain in his calf, a towering silhouette of frontier vengeance in the dim light. "I'm saying I'm done hiding," Wyatt growled, reaching down to pull his Colt .45 from its holster. He popped the cylinder, shaking out the empty brass casings onto the floorboards with a series of sharp metallic clinks. "Blackwood wanted a war over a piece of paper. He burned my barn. He shot at my wife. Now he's going to find out what happens when the mountain bites back." He snapped the cylinder shut, sliding the heavy weapon back onto his hip. He looked down at Evelyn, extending his hand to help her up. "Pack the ledgers, Evelyn," Wyatt commanded, the grit of the frontier hardening every syllable. "Saddle the horses. We aren't waiting for spring. We're taking the fight to Copper Creek." Thud, thud, thud. The heavy, rhythmic striking of iron horseshoes against frozen mud echoed like a war drum. Copper Creek was a miserable scar of civilization carved into the foothills of the Bitterroots. Usually the town bustled with miners, trappers, and cattlemen. But today, under the gray, bruised sky of late winter, the main street was suffocatingly quiet. People stood on the boardwalks, their breaths pluming in the freezing air, their eyes tracking the 2 riders coming down the center of the road. Wyatt Sterling rode tall in the saddle, though it cost him everything. His right leg was bound tightly to the stirrup leather to keep the shattered bone from shifting. His face was a mask of pale granite, bruised from the fight, his jaw set, his pale eyes scanning the rooftops and alleyways with the predatory stillness of a hawk. Riding slightly behind him, on the second recovered gelding, was Evelyn. She wore his oversized canvas duster, the collar turned up against the biting wind. Beneath the heavy coat pressed tightly against her ribs was the leather-bound ledger. They didn't ride to the sheriff's office. Wyatt knew better. He steered his horse into a narrow, shadowed alley between the blacksmith's forge and the general store, dismounting with a suppressed grunt of agony. Evelyn slid down beside him, her boots sinking into the freezing muck. "Look," Wyatt whispered, nodding toward the brick wall of the general store. Nailed to the wood, snapping violently in the wind, was a freshly printed broadside. "Wanted, Wyatt Sterling, for the attempted murder of territorial land commissioners and resisting lawful eviction. $500 reward." Beneath it was a second, smaller poster. "Wanted, Evelyn Vance, fugitive from Chicago, Illinois. Wanted for grand larceny and corporate espionage. $1,000 reward. Consider armed and dangerous." Evelyn stared at the posters, her breath catching in her throat. "Blackwood," she whispered, a cold dread pooling in her stomach. He didn't just survive the fire. He rode straight here and bought the law. He beat us to the narrative. Wyatt reached out, tearing both posters from the wall and crushing the paper in his massive fist. "Sheriff Miller is a coward," Wyatt growled. "If Blackwood paid him enough, Miller will let Blackwood's men hang us in the street and call it frontier justice." Evelyn pulled the heavy ledger from inside her coat. The leather was freezing to the touch. "Then we don't go to the sheriff. We go over his head." She looked up at Wyatt, her hazel eyes blazing with the same fierce intelligence that had captivated him in the cabin. "Circuit Judge Hastings is in town this week. I saw his carriage outside the hotel when we rode in. He's corrupt, but he's a politician. If I put this ledger on his desk and prove I've already telegraphed the U.S. Marshals in Helena, he'll drop Blackwood like a rabid dog to save his own skin." "The telegraph office is 3 blocks down," Wyatt said, his eyes scanning the mouth of the alley. "Hastings is at the Grand Hotel, right across the street from the Silver Dollar Saloon." "I can make it through the back alleys," Evelyn said, checking the twin barrels of her Derringer before slipping it back up her sleeve. "But Blackwood's men will be watching the main street. If they see me before I reach the telegraph operator—" "They won't be looking for you," Wyatt interrupted softly. He reached to his gun belt, unfastening the leather tie-down that kept his Colt .45 secure against his thigh. He checked the cylinder, his thumb expertly testing the smooth action of the hammer. "Wyatt, no." Evelyn grabbed his arm, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She saw the terrifying, icy resolve in his pale eyes. "You can't walk out there. You have a broken leg. You're a walking dead man to them." "I bring hell with me, Evie," Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly rumble. He reached out, his calloused hands framing her face. His thumbs gently brushed the soot and exhaustion from her cheeks. "Blackwood wants a spectacle. He wants to prove he owns this valley by breaking the man who defied him. I'm going to walk right through the front doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon and give him exactly what he wants." "It's suicide," she pleaded, her voice cracking, her fingers twisting into the lapels of his sheepskin coat. "There are too many of them." "It's a distraction," Wyatt corrected, leaning down. He pressed his forehead against hers, closing his eyes for one brief, agonizing second. He breathed in the scent of her, lye soap, vanilla, and the cold winter wind. "I'll draw every gun in town to the center of the street. You run. You send that wire, you corner the judge, and you end this." "Wyatt." A tear slipped free, hot against the freezing air. After 5 years of hiding, he was walking into a firing squad for her. "I made a vow to protect my wife," Wyatt murmured, his lips brushing against hers. It was a fleeting, desperate kiss, a promise sealed in blood and gunpowder. "Now go. I'll find you when the smoke clears." He stepped back, pulling his hat low over his eyes. He didn't use his pine crutch. He forced his shattered leg to bear his weight, his face turning the color of ash from the pain, but his stride was terrifyingly steady as he walked out of the shadows of the alley and into the pale winter light of Main Street. Evelyn watched his broad back for 2 agonizing seconds, her heart screaming at her to pull him back. Then she turned, clutching the ledger to her chest, and sprinted into the labyrinth of back alleys. Wyatt Sterling walked down the center of the muddy street. The boardwalks emptied instantly. Shopkeepers pulled their doors shut, flipping the lock bolts. Women grabbed their children and ducked into the general store. A deadly, suffocating silence fell over Copper Creek, broken only by the heavy, uneven thud, drag thud of Wyatt's boots. He stopped directly in front of the Silver Dollar Saloon. Through the bat-wing doors, the low murmur of voices and the clinking of glasses abruptly ceased. Wyatt stood in the freezing mud, the wind whipping the hem of his coat. He pushed the right side of his coat behind the handle of his Colt, leaving the weapon completely exposed. "Blackwood!" Wyatt's roar tore through the quiet town, echoing off the brick facades of the buildings. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated frontier vengeance. "Come out and collect your bounty!" For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. The wind howled through the eaves of the Grand Hotel behind him. Then the bat-wing doors of the saloon slowly swung open. A man stepped out onto the boardwalk. He didn't wear a cowboy hat. He wore a pristine gray bowler and a tailored wool suit that looked absurdly out of place against the rugged backdrop of Montana. Josiah Blackwood had a face like a polished stone, handsome but entirely devoid of warmth, his eyes as cold and dark as a frozen lake. He looked down at Wyatt with a mixture of amusement and utter disdain. "Mr. Sterling," Blackwood said, his voice smooth and cultured, carrying easily over the wind. "I was told you perished in the fire. It seems my men lack thoroughness." "They lack a spine," Wyatt spat, his hand hovering inches above the worn wooden grip of his Colt. "Just like the man who pays them." Blackwood chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. He took a leisurely draw from a cigar, exhaling a plume of blue smoke into the freezing air. "You're a stubborn relic, Wyatt. You think a gun makes you a king in this valley. But the world has moved on. The railroad is the future. I have the deeds. I have the sheriff. I have the law. You have forged papers and a dead auditor in Chicago," Wyatt growled, his voice carrying enough volume to ensure the terrified townsfolk hiding behind their windows could hear every word. "And you made the fatal mistake of threatening my wife." Blackwood's smile vanished. "Ah, yes, the brilliant, troublesome Mrs. Vance. Or is it Sterling now? Where is the little fugitive hiding? She's out of your reach." "Nothing is out of my reach," Blackwood sneered, flicking his cigar into the mud. He took a step back, gesturing with a gloved hand. "You had your chance to walk away, Sterling. Now you hang." From the shadows of the saloon, men began to emerge. First came the scarred man who had delivered the fake eviction notice to the cabin, a Winchester rifle gripped tightly in his hands. Then came 3 more heavily armed thugs, stepping off the boardwalk and fanning out into the muddy street, their hands resting on the butts of their revolvers. Finally, Sheriff Miller stepped out. The lawman looked pale and sweating, a tin star pinned to his chest, a shotgun trembling in his grip. "Wyatt," Sheriff Miller stammered, looking around nervously. "Wyatt, you're under arrest. Drop your iron. Don't make us do this." "You sold your badge, Miller," Wyatt said, his voice deadly calm. He didn't look at the sheriff. His pale eyes tracked the 4 hired guns spreading out in a semicircle in front of him. "If you raise that scattergun, you'll be the first one to bleed." Miller swallowed hard, taking a cowardly step backward. 5-1. Wyatt stood alone in the center of the street. His broken leg was screaming, a white-hot agony radiating up his spine, but his hand was perfectly steady over his Colt. He could hear the faint, frantic clicking of a telegraph machine coming from a few buildings down. Evelyn was working. He just needed to buy her a few more minutes. The scarred man on the far left sneered, his finger sliding over the trigger of his Winchester. "Any last words, squatter?" Wyatt's pale eyes locked onto the man. He didn't blink, he didn't flinch. He simply shifted his weight, his broad shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch into a gunfighter's stance. "Yeah," Wyatt said softly, the word cutting through the freezing wind like a straight razor. draw. Click, clack, click, clack. The frantic, rhythmic tapping of the brass telegraph key was the only sound in the cramped back room of the Copper Creek dispatch office. Evelyn stood over the terrified operator, her hazel eyes locked on the transmission wire. "Message received in Helena, ma'am." The operator swallowed hard, ripping the paper ticker tape from the machine. "The U.S. Marshals have confirmed receipt of the federal warrants." Evelyn snatched the paper, her heart pounding a violent rhythm against her ribs. "Thank you." She didn't wait for a reply. She bolted out the back door into the freezing mud of the alleyway, clutching the heavy leather ledger to her chest. The Grand Hotel was right next door. She took the wooden fire stairs two at a time, her lungs burning in the icy air, until she reached the second-floor balcony. Down in the street, the silence was deafening. Wyatt Sterling stood like a statue carved from bitter ice. The wind howled down Main Street, whipping the hem of his sheepskin coat. 50 feet in front of him, the scarred man's fingers twitched over the trigger guard of his Winchester. To his left and right, 3 other hired guns mirrored the movement, their eyes locked on Wyatt's exposed Colt .45. Sheriff Miller had already taken 2 steps backward, his shotgun lowered, his cowardice securing his irrelevance. "You're a dead man, Sterling," the scarred man sneered, the bravado masking the slight tremble in his voice. Wyatt's terrifying, unnatural stillness was unnerving them. "Then send me to hell," Wyatt whispered. The scarred man's shoulder dipped. Wyatt didn't think. He didn't blink. The frontier took over. His right hand became a blur of motion. The heavy Colt cleared the leather holster with a sharp snick before the scarred man could even level his Winchester. Boom! The deafening roar of the .45 shattered the town's silence. The heavy slug caught the scarred man dead in the center of his chest, throwing him backward into the freezing mud before his finger could touch the trigger. Wyatt didn't stop to watch him fall. He fanned the hammer with the palm of his left hand, pivoting on his shattered leg with an agonizing grunt. Boom! Boom! 2 more blinding flashes of muzzle flame. The thug on the left took a round in the shoulder, spinning him like a top as he dropped his revolver. The man on the right managed to clear his holster, but Wyatt's 3rd shot shattered the man's knee, sending him screaming into the dirt. The 4th man threw his hands in the air, dropping his gun into the mud and falling to his knees in absolute terror. The gunfight had lasted exactly 3 seconds. A thick cloud of acrid blue gun smoke hung in the freezing air between Wyatt and the saloon. Wyatt stood tall, his chest heaving, his Colt still leveled at the kneeling man. His broken leg screamed, threatening to buckle, but he locked his knee, refusing to fall. "Miller!" Wyatt roared through the smoke. "Pick up their iron!" On the second floor of the Grand Hotel, Evelyn kicked open the door to Suite 204. Circuit Judge Hastings jumped up from his velvet armchair, his brandy snifter shattering on the floorboards. "What is the meaning of this? Who are you?" Evelyn didn't blink. She marched straight to his mahogany desk and slammed the heavy leather ledger down with a thunderous crack. She followed it with the telegraph receipt. "I am Evelyn Vance," she said, her voice dripping with absolute, terrifying authority. "And that is the master ledger of the Northern Pacific right-of-way acquisitions. It details every forged deed, every bribed official, and every murder Josiah Blackwood has orchestrated in the last 3 years." Judge Hastings went ashen. He stared at the ledger as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. "Mrs. Vance, the fugitive." "The U.S. Marshals in Helena don't consider me a fugitive anymore, Judge," Evelyn said coldly, tapping the telegraph receipt. "They consider me a star witness. The wire has been sent. The cavalry is coming. You have exactly 1 minute to decide if you're going to be sitting behind this desk when they arrive, or if you're going to share a hanging rope with Josiah Blackwood." Hastings began to visibly tremble. I had no idea of the violent extent." "Save it for the Marshals," Evelyn snapped. She turned toward the window overlooking Main Street, expecting to see Wyatt. She had heard the 3 deafening gunshots. Her heart was in her throat. She looked down and saw Wyatt standing victorious in the smoke, the hired guns bleeding in the mud. A wave of profound, dizzying relief washed over her. He was alive. But then a flicker of movement caught her eye. Josiah Blackwood hadn't stayed on the street. During the chaos of the draw, the coward had slipped into the hotel lobby and crept up to the second-floor balcony directly adjacent to the judge's window. Evelyn watched in absolute horror as Blackwood stepped out onto the balcony, raising a long-barreled Remington revolver, aiming it directly at Wyatt's exposed back down in the street. Wyatt couldn't see him. The wind was too loud. He wouldn't hear the hammer click. "No!" Evelyn screamed. She didn't hesitate. She threw herself toward the window, pulling the silver derringer from her sleeve. She didn't bother trying to open the sash. Crash! Evelyn smashed the heavy glass with the barrel of her gun and pulled the trigger. The derringer bucked violently. The heavy-caliber bullet tore through the remaining shards of glass and slammed into the wooden balcony pillar a fraction of an inch from Blackwood's face, showering him in sharp splinters. Startled by the exploding wood and glass, Blackwood flinched. His Remington discharged, the bullet whining harmlessly over Wyatt's head and embedding itself in the dirt. Down in the street, Wyatt heard the gunshot from above. He pivoted with terrifying speed, his pale eyes tracking the smoke to the second-floor balcony. He saw Blackwood desperately trying to re-aim the Remington. Wyatt didn't fan the hammer this time. He took a steady, cold aim, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. Boom! The shot was flawless. Wyatt's bullet struck the steel frame of Blackwood's Remington, shattering the weapon entirely, and mangling Blackwood's right hand in a spray of blood and shrapnel. Blackwood screamed, collapsing onto the balcony floor, clutching his ruined hand to his chest. The silence that followed was absolute. The reign of the Northern Pacific Syndicate in Copper Creek was over. Sheriff Miller, finally realizing which way the wind was blowing, rushed forward with his handcuffs, eager to arrest the bleeding men in the street to save his own badge. Wyatt lowered his Colt, the barrel smoking in the cold air. He looked up at the shattered second-story window. Through the jagged glass, he saw Evelyn. She was breathing hard, her derringer still raised, her hazel eyes locked onto his. Wyatt felt a massive, overwhelming surge of emotion crack his chest wide open. They had done it. They had survived. He holstered his gun and immediately began the agonizing, limping walk toward the hotel lobby. He needed to hold her. He needed to tell her that the war was over. But when Wyatt finally dragged himself up the stairs and threw open the door to Suite 204, Judge Hastings was sitting at his desk, shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. Evelyn was gone. Wyatt's heart stopped. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on the mahogany desk. Sitting neatly on top of the damning ledger was Wyatt's heavy canvas duster, neatly folded. Pinned to the collar was the silver derringer. She had left her armor behind. The threat was over, and the fugitive had finished her job. The Copper Creek train depot was a hollow, echoing cavern of iron and wood. The massive steam locomotive hissed on the tracks, the conductor calling for final boarding on the eastbound line to Chicago. Evelyn stood on the platform, the bitter wind whipping at her drab gray woolen dress. She held her battered leather trunk by the handle. She had no coat. She had left it for Wyatt. She was freezing, but the cold on her skin was nothing compared to the absolute hollow ache radiating in her chest. She looked up at the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains one last time. She had saved the man she loved. Josiah Blackwood would hang. The ledgers were in federal hands, and Wyatt Sterling's ranch was safe forever. Their arrangement was complete. Wyatt was a man of honor. He had protected her because it was his duty. But she knew his heart was buried in the snow with his first wife. She wouldn't force him to stay in a marriage born of a business transaction. Not when the danger had passed. "All aboard!" the conductor shouted over the hiss of the steam. Evelyn closed her eyes, fighting the hot tears threatening to spill, and took a step toward the passenger car. "Evelyn!" The voice was a raw, gravelly roar that cut through the noise of the locomotive like a thunderclap. Evelyn froze, her hand gripping the iron railing of the train stairs. She turned slowly. Wyatt Sterling was standing at the far end of the platform. He looked terrible. His face was bruised and streaked with gunpowder and soot. He was leaning heavily on his makeshift pine crutch, his shattered leg trembling with the effort of keeping him upright. But his pale eyes were locked onto her with a fierce, burning intensity that pinned her to the spot. He began to walk toward her. It was a slow, agonizing limp, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden planks. Evelyn's breath hitched. She dropped her trunk. "Wyatt, what are you doing here? Your leg, you should be with the doctor." "What am I doing here?" Wyatt interrupted, closing the final few feet between them. He stopped right in front of her, towering over her, his chest heaving with exertion. He reached into the inner pocket of his sheepskin coat. "I came to fix a mistake." He pulled out a folded piece of thick official parchment. Evelyn recognized it instantly. It was their marriage certificate from the Copper Creek courthouse. "The threat is over, Wyatt," Evelyn said, her voice trembling violently, trying to maintain her legal, detached composure. "Blackwood is in custody. Your ranch is safe. I release you from the contract. You don't owe me your name anymore." Wyatt stared down at her. He looked at the tears shimmering in her hazel eyes, the fierce independence she wore like a shield, and the profound, agonizing love she was trying so desperately to hide from him. Wyatt took the legally binding marriage certificate in both hands. With a loud, definitive rip, he tore it cleanly in half. He put the pieces together and tore them again, letting the shreds of paper fall to the frozen platform floor. Evelyn gasped, stepping back. "Wyatt!" "That was a contract for a housekeeper," Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a low, rough whisper that vibrated with raw emotion. He dropped his crutch. It clattered loudly against the wood, but he didn't care. He caught his balance by reaching out and framing her face with both of his massive, calloused hands. "I don't want a housekeeper, Evelyn," he murmured, his thumbs gently wiping the tears from her cheeks. "I don't want a business partner. I want the woman who shot a timber wolf off my front porch. I want the woman who dragged me out of a blizzard and fought a war to save my life. I want my wife." Evelyn's breath caught in a choked sob. "Wyatt, your past, your heart." "You thawed it out, Evie," Wyatt confessed, leaning down, his forehead resting against hers. 5 years I spent in the dark. I thought I was dead, but then you walked into my cabin, and you brought the light with you. I love you, Evelyn. I love you, and if you get on that train, I will limp all the way to Chicago to bring you back." The last remnants of Evelyn's iron composure shattered completely. She let out a breathless, watery laugh, her hands flying up to grip the lapels of his heavy coat. She pulled him down to her, crashing her lips against his. Wyatt groaned, wrapping his arms around her waist, lifting her clean off the platform boards despite the screaming pain in his leg. He kissed her with all the desperate, fierce passion he had buried for 5 years. It was a kiss of gunpowder, of survival, and of a profound, unbreakable promise. Behind them, the train whistle blew a final time, and the locomotive pulled away from Copper Creek, heading east. Evelyn didn't even hear it go. She was already home. 1 year later, the Bitterroot Valley was alive with the brilliant emerald green of springtime. The air smelled of wet earth, blooming Indian paintbrush, and the rich scent of freshly cut pine. Inside the Sterling cabin, the heavy winter shutters had been thrown wide open, letting the golden afternoon sunlight spill across the floorboards. The iron stove was radiating a gentle heat, carrying the sweet aroma of baking bread and roasting coffee. Wyatt sat by the hearth, his bad leg stretched out comfortably before him. He still walked with a slight limp when the weather turned cold, but the crutch was long gone. In his lap was a block of pale, smooth oak. He worked a whittling knife with practiced, careful strokes, curling thin ribbons of wood onto the floor, as the shape of a beautifully arched cradle rocker began to emerge. The front door opened, and the warm spring breeze swept into the room. Evelyn stepped inside, carrying a small basket of fresh eggs from the newly rebuilt barn. She looked radiant. The hollows of her cheeks had filled out, her skin glowing with health and the undeniable heavy curve of her swollen belly pressing against the apron of her calico dress. Wyatt stopped carving immediately. He set the knife and the wood aside, pushing himself up from the chair to take the heavy basket from her hands. "I told you to let me gather those," Wyatt scolded gently, though his pale eyes were warm and crinkled with a smile he wore easily these days. He set the basket on the table and wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, resting his large hands gently over her pregnant belly. Evelyn leaned back into his solid chest, a sigh of pure contentment escaping her lips. "I'm pregnant, Wyatt, not made of glass. Besides, I needed a break. The Miller family from down the valley brought over a boundary dispute contract they wanted me to review." Ever since the fall of Josiah Blackwood, Evelyn Sterling had become the unofficial legal counsel for the entire territory. Ranchers trusted the fierce woman who had outsmarted a syndicate, and she spent her mornings sitting at her mother's embroidered tablecloth, ensuring no family ever lost their land to a forged deed again. Wyatt pressed a soft kiss to the side of her neck. "Tell Miller his contract can wait. You work too hard, counselor." "Look who's talking," Evelyn teased, turning in his arms to wrap her hands around his neck. She looked toward the hearth at the half-finished oak cradle. "You've been working on that since sunrise." "Only the best for the newest Sterling," Wyatt murmured, his gaze dropping to her belly before rising back to meet her hazel eyes. The silence that settled over the cabin wasn't the heavy, oppressive quiet of a harsh winter or a cold arrangement. It was the peaceful, golden stillness of two people who had fought through the darkest storms to build a life together. Wyatt leaned down, capturing her lips in a slow, searing kiss that tasted of coffee and forever. Outside, the Bitterroot Mountains stood tall and unyielding. But inside the cabin, the ice was gone for good. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.